Hi, this is Sally, and welcome to Reclaiming Pride, LGBT plus survivors of narcissistic abuse. Before we start, there is a trigger warning. The episodes of this podcast may at times refer to domestic violence, emotional, financial, and sexual abuse. To begin, I'd like us to start with a one-word feelings check. That's, what is one word for how you are feeling right now in this moment? Not necessarily how other people around you are feeling, or how other people you may be taking care of are feeling, but how are you feeling in this moment in one word? A question I often get asked by listeners of the podcast is NPD or narcissistic personality disorder a nature or nurture situation? In other words, is someone born a narcissist or do they become one? Well, ultimately, the jury is still out a little bit on this. However, recent research has shown that there are differences in brain structure for those folks who have narcissistic personality disorder and also antisocial personality disorder, better known as psychopathy. The Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or more commonly known as the DSM, published its 5th edition in 2022. Now, this manual outlines all of the personality disorders that we currently know of, one of which is the B cluster personality disorder known as NPD. Following are the 9 criteria that describe this particular disorder. 1. The person has a grandiose sense of self-importance, for example, exaggerates achievements and talents, expects to be recognized as superior without commensurate achievements. 2. Is preoccupied with fantasies of unlimited success, power, brilliance, beauty, or ideal love. 3. Believes that he or she is special and unique and can only be understood by or associate with other special or high-status people or institutions. 4. Requires excessive admiration. 5. Has a sense of entitlement, i.e. unreasonable expectations of especially favorable treatment automatically with his or her expectations. 6. Is interpersonally exploitative, i.e. takes advantage of others to achieve his or her own ends. 7. Lacks empathy, is unwilling to recognize or identify with the feelings and needs of others. 8. Is often envious of others or believes that others are envious of them. And 9. Shows arrogant, haughty behaviors or attitudes. The DSM requires indications of 5 or more of these 9 traits in order to classify someone as NPD. I have to admit that in revisiting these traits, I know I live with all 9 of them in my last relationship for 13 years. Many times when the abuse was happening, I would try to connect with my ex as I could literally see what was going on. In the later stages of the relationship, I'd read and listened to so much on NPD, I could almost predict what was coming next, as the pathology was so strong. But I kept trying. History was repeating itself, and I was almost that little kid again, begging my mum not to drink, but it was useless. You may as well try and talk someone out of being schizophrenic or having bipolar disorder. It won't work, and it's heartbreaking. Particularly if you are someone who has suffered abandonment trauma at other times in your life, or worse still, grew up with a narcissistic parent or parents. It's a literal nightmare. Indeed, you could even be dealing with a malignant narcissist. This is somebody at the complete extreme end of the NPD spectrum. This is the closest you can get to antisocial personality disorder, more commonly known as psychopathy. I talk at length about this in episode 8, which is entitled, What Type is Your Narcissist? Grandiose, malignant, covert manipulative, communal, or benign. So the question remains, is someone born a narcissist, or is this something that is created by a series of traumatic events over time? Let's look at some of the most recent research in the medical field and what the medical journals have to say about the biologic, neuropsychiatric, and genetic pieces of NPD. You might be interested to know that structural and functional brain imaging have identified differences in the brain regions of individuals with narcissistic personality disorder. Recent studies show that the left anterior insula, as well as the other frontal limbic structures, have smaller grey matter volume in comparison with a non-clinical control subject. So in other words, the parts of the brain that are areas controlling emotional empathy as well as low self-esteem, empathic processing, anxiety-producing stimuli, and social interaction are shrunken and smaller in people with NPD. You might not be too surprised to know this if you've lived with anyone who has NPD, that this part of the brain and its networks also help a person switch between an internal state and an external state, as well as filtering and integrating sensory and emotional stimuli. Listeners, in other words, this means that people with NPD will do and say things that people without NPD would not normally do and say because their filters function differently. This can, of course, play itself out in verbal, physical, and emotional abuse, or all of the above. This person will literally do whatever they please because their brain is misstructured in this way. In addition, the salience network, which is important for anyone's ability to empathize, is also severely limited in people who have been diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder. Dysfunctions in all of these brain areas usually leads to an overfocus on internal processes rather than the outside world, and also a relative lack of empathy, and this is often seen in clinically narcissistic people. The anterior, insular, and frontolimbic structures have consistent empirical support from neuroimaging studies which implicates the role of this brain structure in narcissism and narcissistic personality disorder. So there you are, you can literally see it on a brain scan. Now, venturing outside of the brain and into the more whole body experience of somebody who has NPD, there have even been skin conductance studies recently carried out. These studies measure the physiological arousal levels in humans. Frighteningly, these studies have shown that people with high level of narcissism have similar responses to those of psychopathic individuals. Both narcissists and those with antisocial personality disorder show a marked impaired ability to inhibit their behaviors or impulsivity due to the low physiological activity after stimulus. In other words, they require extreme stimulus, and they will not inhibit themselves in acquiring it. There are also high levels of hyperreactivity measured in the brain of people with NPD linked with stressful events. This part of the brain is called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And we talk about this in another episode of this podcast when we address intermittent reinforcement and operant conditioning. You may have found it surprising and even shocking that there are visible differences in the brains of people who have moderate to severe narcissistic personality disorder that are almost the same as those of somebody with antisocial personality disorder. So what about the genetic basis for NPD? Is there one? Is there something that can be passed down in families? Well, let's take a look at what one of the most recent British medical journals has to say about what we call heritability. So that means the inherited traits which can manifest as a personality disorder. There have been a limited number of studies looking at the genetic basis for NPD. A number of different twin studies have given estimates of heritability for NPD as falling between 24% likelihood and 79% likelihood. So what this means is that they use sets of twins, which is quite a common practice, to see the differences that may occur in identical twins when they are each exposed to differing stimuli. The study found significant correlations of father-daughter levels of narcissism in physiological family groups, but not for other parent-offspring formations. So cautiously at the moment, studies are suggesting that there may actually be an X chromosome involvement in all of this. So although the degree of heritability varies quite a lot between the different studies, there is evidence to suggest that the trait of narcissism is inheritable. The clinical journal does go on to say, however, that aspects such as the role of attachment and environment for a child can also have an important role in the formation of pathological narcissism. In other words, at the moment, it's both nature and nurture, but the relevant contribution of each is still unknown. Therefore, there remains an ongoing area of investigation that will require further research into whether someone is born with narcissistic personality disorder or whether it's a mixture of being born with heritable traits and also being exposed to other stimuli which may have brought the trait to the forefront. So having looked at both the brain structure and the possible genetic influences over whether someone has NPD, now let's take a look at some cultural considerations. In 1979, researchers Lash and Stern wrote about the rise of narcissism in the United States and the cultural contributions to this. More recently, researchers Tweng and Campbell measured personality traits in the general population and noted an increasing sense of entitlement in those tested who were born after 1982. They put this down to changes in parenting to a more permissive style and the increased use of social media. Permissive parenting can lead to young people feeling entitled to things without actually accomplishing what is necessary in order to attain them. Social media, as well, as you know, encourages most people to seek out superficial affirmation of their self-worth. So for a young person, this is particularly striking because they are still forming their personality. But is this clinical narcissism? Or is this simply an entitled person? The likelihood that these young folks in the study would be abusive, verbally, physically, or emotional to other people is highly unlikely unless they were pathologically narcissistic or had some other kind of personality disorder. For me, I would say there is a marked difference between an entitled person and someone who has a pathological disorder. The way that these two aspects of narcissism are conflated, I think, can be problematic and lead to the word narcissist being thrown around willy-nilly and misused. And we've talked about this in previous episodes as well. This can actually be very invalidating for somebody who is either in or has been in the trauma that is living with somebody who has narcissistic personality disorder. So when the word narcissist is kind of flippantly thrown around, this can be very invalidating and also stressful and traumatic for somebody who's actually put up with this and has suffered under this, sometimes for decades. An entitled person is extremely different from someone who's pathologically abusive because they have a full-blown personality disorder. Honestly, anyone who's lived with someone who has 5 or more of the DSM-5 traits of NPD will tell you that immediately. However, other studies also show evidence of increasing NPD. A survey done in 2008 showed that people aged 20 to 29 are almost 3 times more likely than people over 65 to meet the criteria for NPD as defined by the DSM-5 criteria that we talked about at the start of the podcast. Now, this is startling, and the amount of variables involved in this are so numerous, but startling nonetheless. Fascinatingly, one study showed that between the ages of 7 and 12 years, parental overvaluation predicted a different type of narcissism than lack of parental warmth. So in other words, if a child is overpraised and overvalued, it seems to be a predictor of a more overt narcissist in later life if the person does end up exhibiting traits of NPD, whereas a coldness or lack of warmth and attachment from a parent in early life can actually lead to more covert narcissism in later life for that child. Other influences, such as childhood adversity, have also been associated with the development of NPD. When treating all of this, therapists are often told to avoid power struggles with the NPD individual, including who is right and who is wrong, those sorts of things. It is common that a power struggle may also take the form of the NPD individual refusing to talk, so the silent treatment, right, just like they do in relationships, or engage only superficially with a therapist, again, something that they will do in relationships. The narcissist does this in order to maintain control of the treatment, just the same way as they do it to control you in a relationship. The narcissist will also put any therapist who agrees to treat them through the same cycle that they put their intimate partners, friends, and family members and children through. This would, of course, be the idealization, devaluation, discard, and then hoovering someone back phases. Like many of the people listening to this podcast right now, the therapists themselves may initially feel charmed or seduced into thinking that the therapy is working, it's going really well because of the love bombing they're receiving from the narcissistic patient. But lying just underneath that surface, if you scratch it, are, of course, the devaluation and discard stages that are shortly going to follow. What we can say in conclusion is the nature versus nurture debate surrounding NPD remains a complex and multifaceted issue. The DSM-5 outlines 9 criteria for NPD, requiring the presence of 5 or more for the diagnosis. Personal anecdotes often provide poignant understanding of these traits, so that's often why I'll kind of share stories from my own experience here. The traits of NPD disorder can have a profound impact on someone who lives with somebody who has NPD. As we navigate these complexities, it's evident that understanding NPD requires a comprehensive approach. So this week, we've delved into the intricacies of NPD, providing valuable insights into the nature-nurture aspects of this challenging and abusive personality disorder. For those of us grappling with the aftermath of relationships with individuals with NPD, it's essential to acknowledge the deep emotional impact that this has had. Therapists in particular must tread very carefully. They need to avoid power struggles and recognize the cyclical patterns inherent in narcissistic behavior. They're the same everywhere. That's one of the most predictable things about these people. And as the medical community strives for a more comprehensive understanding, we remain on a journey of exploration. We can seek answers here in this podcast and elsewhere to the fundamental question: is someone born a narcissist, or is this a product of their life experiences, or is it both? The quest for clarity continues, urging us to delve deeper into the intricate web of NPD's origins. The most important thing for us to remember, though, is, as survivors, knowledge is power. Knowledge of all of this can help to set you free physically and emotionally from your abuser. Now, that was a huge and heavy amount of information. I do hope it helped to shed some light on the more clinical aspects of NPD so that you can gain more knowledge of the nightmare you have lived with. None of it was your fault. And the more we uncover through research, the clearer this is becoming. Let's take a quick break, and afterwards, I'll be back with this week's listener question. I'll see you in a moment. Welcome back. This week's listener question is, like those with psychopathy, do narcissists learn their behaviors through mimicry? Might they watch movies and take mental notes of what pleases people in order to manipulate them? Thanks for this one. So in terms of learned behaviors, individuals with NPD traits may indeed observe and mimic certain behaviors that they perceive as successful or advantageous to themselves. So this can include studying social dynamics, observing how people respond to certain actions, and adjusting their own behavior accordingly. However, the motives for this behavior might differ from those of someone with psychopathy. So for example, I remember my ex was extremely interested in a field of study called social engineering, and it really just hits all of the salient points that I just listed. So as I just said, there's a difference though because in your question you talked about the way that psychopaths or someone with ASPD might mimic other people. And, yes, and narcissists do this also, but there are differences. So what are those differences? The difference starts really with motivation for manipulation. For narcissists, the primary motivation for manipulation is often rooted in a strong desire for admiration of themselves, validation of themselves, and a sense of superiority. So they might manipulate others to maintain an inflated self-image and to ensure that they are constantly receiving the attention and praise that they believe they deserve at all times. However, for psychopaths, they may engage in manipulation for more instrumental reasons, such as personal gain or power, and they have a complete lack of regard for the well-being of others. Their manipulation tends to be more strategic and less focused on the need for constant attention and admiration. Do you hear the difference? Then the other difference is empathy. So narcissists, while they lack empathy to some extent, some more than others, they may still experience empathy in certain situations, even if it's just selfish. Their empathy deficit is much more selective, and they might be capable of understanding and recognizing others' emotions, even if they struggle to genuinely care about them, right? So psychopathy, on the other hand, is characterized by a more profound and pervasive lack of empathy. Psychopaths often have difficulty understanding or connecting with the emotions of others, if at all, and their manipulative behaviors may be driven by a profound lack of concern for the well-being of other people. It's also essential to recognize, though, that these are all generalizations and individuals can exhibit a range of behaviors that may not neatly fit into one box or another. Additionally, both narcissistic personality disorder and psychopathy fall under the broader category of personality disorders, and their manifestations can vary wildly among individuals. For example, you could have a psychopath who is the CEO of a company and more or less flies under the radar for their whole life, and then you have Jeffrey Dahmer, for example. So it can play itself out in wildly different ways. So the bottom line is that the answer is yes, narcissists do engage in mimicry, as they also fundamentally lack an essential and grounding sense of self, right? So they have to look at other people in order to know what to mirror. They use what they have observed to their own gain. They'll also find out things about you and throw it back in your face to get narcissistic supply to see you go through emotions so that they can mirror those too. But their gain often differs slightly from those with psychopathy or ASPD. So I hope that this has helped to answer your question that they both do it, but for different reasons. If you'd like to ask a question and have it answered here on the podcast, you can post it on the Instagram or Facebook accounts for the podcast, and they're both linked on the website banner. Please note, this podcast is not intended to replace professional therapy or counselling. It serves as a supplementary resource for support and encouragement. Listeners, you are encouraged to seek professional help if needed. I did, and it works for me every day. Stay tuned, and I look forward to healing with you again next time. Bye-bye.